Climate change is a result of our take, make, waste economy. And until now, we've looked at solving climate change largely by switching to renewable energy. We're replacing fossil fuels with wind and solar power at speed all over the world. But the truth is that the energy transition will only solve half the climate problem. It's like we've been reading only half the book, like we've been watching only half the movie. So what completes the picture? Transforming how industry uses materials and how we manage land. That is, transitioning to a circular economy. It's more than energy. It's about transformation. What does that mean? It means we address things before they become a problem and design out emissions before production even begins. We build an economy that eliminates waste and pollution, keeps products and materials in use, and regenerates natural systems. The circular economy can help address climate change by reducing emissions from industry, land use, and agriculture. So how do we make this transition? By businesses embedding the circular economy in their climate strategies and redesigning products and services. By governments setting enabling policies and putting the necessary infrastructure in place. By investors mobilizing capital towards circular economy solutions.
The circular economy plays a really key role in solving many of the problems around climate change. But what it also does is it builds a more resilient economy.
A complete picture of a thriving, zero-emissions economy is coming into focus. The mission now is to make it a reality.
Oh, maybe the logo's going to stay there. Welcome everyone here, welcome everyone online. This is a session looking at systems thinking and the importance of circularity for decarbonisation. So in the video you just saw, it started to get at some of the reasons why we need to look beyond just how we power the economy to also looking at how we produce and consume within the economy. There are certain emissions that are embedded in how we produce and consume that just by switching to renewable energy will not help us hit net zero. So for example, there are emissions from industrial processes, chemical processes, from when we deforest and how we use the land, and also from waste management. In the current system where we landfill and incinerate a lot, the emissions come from that as well. The transition to renewable energy, sadly, won't be able to tackle those. So we need other solutions. One of those is the circular economy. And in our research, we found that 45% of the emissions are coming from the examples that I just gave. So it's a really big part on why the circular economy is so important. So I'm delighted to have been asked to moderate this session at the Swedish Pavilion. I'm delighted that we've got a whole mix of companies joining us today to talk about their experiences in trying to integrate circular economy into their businesses. We'll also have a chance to look a little bit at the accounting for circular economy emissions, and hopefully it'll help give a bit of a flavor of what this means in practice, some of the opportunities, but also some of the challenges. And we don't have any policymakers on the panel, but this is obviously a COP with plenty of policymakers around, so we'll also think a little bit about the policy needs that each of these businesses face and the collaboration that's needed with policy. So on that note, I'd be delighted to welcome Aya, who is Vice President of Corporate Affairs from Tetra Pak, and our other panelist is online, Owen from Volvo Cars, who is Head of Circular Economy. Now, I'm not quite sure where he's going to appear. There he is. Hi, Owen. Can you hear us okay?
Yeah, I can hear you perfectly. Can you hear me?
Yeah, fantastic. So some people will know both your companies, but not everyone. So I wondered if you could, Aya, we'll start with you. If you could give a brief introduction of what your company does, but also just give us the beginnings of an idea as to where circular economy fits in for Tetra Pak.
Very good. So many of you, or those of you who know Tetra Pak, may have seen little packages here, and they would know us as a packaging company. So, and that is basically the innovation that we are built upon. But we are also a company which is one of the world's largest food processing technology and equipment companies. So we have those two sides. So we're really at the center of food systems, one could say. And when we talk about our climate targets, again, Tetra Pak has been very forward-looking. So we were one of the first in the industry actually to come up with science-based targets, and now amongst the 61st ones to come up with net zero targets, both long-term and short-term. And I think immediately when you kind of know that our business is built on packages, you will understand that circular economy plays a huge role in our climate transitions and green transition overall. So maybe I could reflect a couple of things in this context. So when we look into packaging, what is really important is the materials, of course, and one of our commitments, which is relevant towards the climate targets, is that by 2030, all the materials used are renewable or recycled content. And this means that as part of our science-based targets, the suppliers also play a huge role. So we have 45 suppliers which are part of our what we call the base materials for packaging initiative, where they have 20 commitments that they have to make, and circularity is one of the areas where they actually have to make commitments, and it ranges from individual material transitions to collaboration in different material groups. So we have targets in the packaging area for circularity, which I think are relevant for the climate side, which is about the design. So design for recycling, we have our internal design for recycling guidelines, so that the package, when it's designed to be brought to a market, it actually fits into the collection and recycling systems in a given market. And why is this important? Because if you look into the life cycle of a packaging and start counting CO2, the end of life is extremely important in the calculations. So that's one thing. And the second commitment we have is in terms of collection and recycling of our packaging. And that again is, we have, for instance, a European-wide target, which actually is our industry target. And then we have, for each of the markets where we operate or our packaging is brought into, we have collection and recycling targets. And why is this, again, super relevant? Is that because we are a global company, and the beauty of our packaging is that the design actually is such that it preserves food for a long time. So it uses this shelf-stable kind of technologies, which means that it can be exported to countries where they need food, or let's say there's a crisis, food crisis, so these packages would come to a country where maybe the recycling system is not fully developed. So we actually commit to supporting the collection and recycling in those markets. So this is quite a big part of our business, but then we have the other part, which is the processing. And we're not as advanced in circular economy maybe there, but we hope to develop this area, because we see that there's a couple of things where it really makes a huge difference, and that's really food loss and food waste. And what we have done is that we have done studies to understand how basically if you have so let's say that you for instance do something of orange juice, and you have oranges which are basically rejected then as part of the process. So if you could actually avoid those food waste or loss emissions and bring those oranges into a new form of resource as new food for humans or animals. So how could you actually measure that and have targets in that area? And another area where we're developing targets is also that currently we are one of the biggest packaging companies serving the dairy industry. So again, I think dairy and animal proteins, they have still a very big role in the world, But there's also a big role that plant-based and transitions into other types of proteins will have. So we're developing technology solutions and working in collaboration with some companies like Alfa Laval over there to actually create proteins from whether it's algae or it's fungi or other things. And again, this way it's both decarbonizing, but it could be food residues and other things which then serve as alternative protein. And we have great examples in this area already.
Okay, great. Maybe we'll come back to some of them. And I really liked what you said about thinking about the packaging, thinking about the food, but knowing that the two sort of go together. So when you take it to another system, export it to another country, you also need to start thinking about that system of recycling, which with a systems thinking approach is absolutely critical. Owen, completely different industry. Tell us a bit about Volvo Cars and where circular economy is fitting in for your climate targets.
Very happy to be here. Thank you very much for the invite. So Volvo Cars, many of you will know, put cars onto the market, and we also offer mobility solutions with Volvo On Demand. Last year, we placed 700,000 vehicles onto the market, and each of those vehicles weighs around 1.8, 1.9 tons. So clearly the resources that we consume are vast. In the supply chain, we also know that the 2 tons has a basic multiplying factor. So for each ton of material, there is more resource consumed in the value chain. We're doing studies on that at the moment to sort of quantify the scale of that. And we know that for each ton of material used, there is a carbon factor. And so clearly, as a company that wants to be climate neutral by 2040 and a circular business by 2040, these are fundamental factors that we have to tackle. I think it plays a part in the organization when we are designing vehicles, and that can be 3, 4, 5 years out from the point at which they're placed on the market. And then we can also support the upgrades and improvements of vehicles in cycle as well. So we can find new suppliers and new components that are better from a circular economy perspective. But for Volvo Cars, I think it's been clear that we want to lead in the automotive space. We were one of the first to commit to BEV-only vehicles by 2030. And we're committed to being a circular business by 2040. And by making that statement, we have to give a bit more meat on the bones. And so I think it's really important that right now we're working together with a team of experts across the company to develop the strategy and the roadmap to get us there. And we really look forward to sort of releasing some of the mechanics of that and the details behind that. But what I can say is that we are mindful that we are very good at what we do in a lean perspective, but we are not as well engaged in the supply chain as we need to be. As I highlighted earlier, that a vehicle being 1.8 tons has a huge proportion of impact in the supply chain, and we equate that to about 86 tons per vehicle. This is vast. And so we have to find a way that we can subsidize some of that raw material with recycled content and expand that and create it much more efficient cars for recycling. And so really that's what we're doing at the moment. We're trying to find ways that we can work with the upcoming vehicles, that 26, 27, but then also make changes to the vehicles that are on the market or will be on the market very soon, where we have slightly less wiggle room because we've already sort of agreed with suppliers what we're going to do, but there's still room to have some sort of negotiation. But my key focus at the moment is outlining the direction and the vision and the plan and the strategy. And what we've agreed this year is that our goal is to define circular business as decoupling growth from resource consumption. And that means virgin resource consumption to begin with. So to help us get on the journey to improving what we're doing. But then next, it will take into account other resources beyond materials, such as energy and water, so that we can decouple our growth from those things as well. Beyond that, we're working with the whole company, R&D, to find ways that new materials can be put into the vehicle, and find out how we can support Volvo On Demand to provide mobility solutions that mean people can use cars more effectively and efficiently, rather than having 90-95% downtime of the vehicles that we put on the market. So for us, circular economy is a fundamental to the organization's sustainability strategy, which is one of the core three pillars to our organization. And look forward to discussing a bit more of that in detail with you as we go on this conversation.
And I think one of the things that you both brought out is that by going to a circular economy model, it is an opportunity, and there are plenty of difficulties, but I think both of you see it as a space where you both want to lead, which almost reinforces that sometimes with the circular economy, it defaults to being thought about in terms of design, and there is a huge design element, but it's circular economy. It is about the economy, and I think for both your companies, you're wanting to lead in that space. I'm going to push you to be shorter on your answers, but partnership is absolutely critical for you moving forward in circular economy. Can you give us one example of a partnership that's being key to helping you realize some of your targets?
Well, obviously, Ellen MacArthur Foundation plays such a huge role in this area. Of course it does, but it's and I think in terms of contextually, there needs to be global leaders like Ellen MacArthur Foundation or platforms like the Consumer Goods Forum, for instance, in our area, that are getting people together with ideas and push for those areas where you can drive change kind of from the global perspective. But I would say that in all areas that we work on, whether it's packaging or processing or food systems, it's really about local ecosystems, and it's as part of a product or solutions life cycle, you will have different types of partnerships. So I really don't want to, put out one element, but I'd just like to say that it can't be one partnership because that wouldn't fit into that. And in a given context, like if you work in the developing world, you will already have, a bit of challenges on who you partner with. So there may be, the best in class partners would already be some with examples or kind of experience in this area. But for instance, I'd say that one experience that we've been kind of experimenting on is the waste picker communities in many countries on how to then bring informal sector to more towards formal sector and collaborate in that area and with some of these NGOs. So there are also global waste picker NGOs that we've been collaborating with, or UN organizations. So that may be as just an example how different the models can be for different products as well.
I think what you bring out there is you need to think about local ecosystems, but of course it's still a global system. So it's almost like localized across a global value chain, which is critical. Owen, it is the COP of implementation. What are some of the quick wins that you found, but what are some of the bigger wins that might be a little bit harder to get at, but you're working on?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and implementation and execution are the real pillars of what we're doing at the moment. Jim, our new CEO, talks about execute, and it's something that we're really focused on at the moment. To be honest with you, the scale of the automotive sector is so vast. Any quick win is still complex. And I think one of the areas where we see a sort of quicker wins are in the way that we change our sort of scope 1 impact. And we've made some really, really good progress on improving waste prevention in our supply chain, in our own facility, and the way in which we are recirculating material from our manufacturing sites and using water, which is sometimes undervalued here. We've gone from using water quite sort of effectively to say, well, we're going to cut down that effective water use by 25%, and we've overachieved on that target, and we've actually extended our 2025 target to be 40% reductions on a 2018 baseline. So we're making progress in-house, and I would say that it's not a quick win, but it's quicker than some of the big challenges that we have. And for us and the automotive industry as a whole, we have some really massive but really high priority focus areas. And I'd point out one in particular, which is that the end of life of vehicles is often seen as being a very effective market. And I don't disagree that we do recycle vehicles in high quantity. But what we also do is we downgrade that material And so one thing that we're going to have to work on as an industry, and a major push from us and others in the OEM space at the moment, is a way that we can deal with vehicles at the end of life, so we can more effectively dismantle and reuse components, and then find ways to recycle and separate and shred and reuse that material so that we can keep it at the highest value possible, because at the moment we don't believe it is. So that's a major change that we have to have. And I might point out one other change, because I think it's critical that people understand how they can engage with the circular economy and decarbonisation. And there's a really hard challenge that we as consumers have. We have to understand how we can use vehicles differently. We have to understand how we can share vehicles, how we can have mobility services that are actually effective beyond just inner city opportunities. So this is something that everyone's going to have to understand. How can we engage with mobility in a slightly different way? And that's a major challenge, and it provides huge opportunities. You point out there the economic side of circular economy. We've got a 1 billion SEK target by 2025. And we're well on track to reach that, but it requires offers and smart solutions for customers to engage with mobility in new ways. So we have to be smart and we have to drive the conversation, but that is a major challenge. And I think most people in the audience there and most people watching online will recognize that people buy bigger cars today than they did 10 years ago, and they use them maybe the same amount, but do you need that size of vehicle? And it's a really big challenge that we have to overcome as an industry, how to sell different types of mobility and vehicles that are smaller but still can be seen as premium. Those are two big challenges, and some quick wins for you.
Thank you.
I need to tell you, because yesterday we were on this stage and we were supposed to come up with personal commitments, and I must say that I have one now finally. I couldn't come up with one yesterday, but I've just given up my car, so I've contributed to your targets maybe.
Very good. Collaboration across sectors. And I think one of the things that you point to is Sometimes on the material side, the circular economy is advancing faster, and where it's coming down to reimagining business models and how you fit into the economy in that sense, there is quite a lot more progress to do. So you have no time to answer this question, so you're going to have to be super short. Obviously, we've all heard the reports, we are off track. We talk about 2030, just to make that really practical. That is only 7 years away. You've mentioned in the transition plan, some of these you might have it in the strategy, but that doesn't mean it's implemented tomorrow. It takes time to work it through the system. So thinking about where policy can help bring more incentive to get you to move faster, what are your top 2 asks of policy in the near term for your respective industries? Owen, go first. Keep it short.
I think the first one is incentives for organizations who have advanced dismantling and reprocessing approaches to end-of-life vehicles. Give them better incentives, support them, and make it the direction of travel for the aftermarket, not just the aftermarket, but the dismantling, scrap, and recycling sectors. That's the first one. And the second one is we don't give support to mobility solutions in cities. They're taxed like taxis, so that means they get incredibly high tax. So another one would be try and find solutions for vehicles that are there for shared mobility that are sort of incentivizing lower cost solutions to organizations putting them on the market.
Fantastic, thank you. Aya.
So just to be quick, I'll align with your first one, because so for the food processing side, also incentives for servitization or refurbishment of equipment. I mean, that type of policies would indeed take that forward as well. And there's so much to do in the decarbonizing of the technologies used. But then the second one, definitely, which is more of a favorite for me, would be that not only at EU level, but also at more global level, there would be a regulation related to food waste and food loss, which would also be, it can be a carrot or it can be a whip, but whatever it is, I think that's a big one. So that's 8% of global emissions, food waste and food loss. So definitely that would advance things.
Okay, great. Thank you both so much for joining us. Totally different sectors, but both are definitely working on circular economy and bringing it more into your business and climate plans. It's key that that connection is made. So thank you for joining us. So both of them touched a lot on the value chain, and that's something that I want to explore with our next guest. Christian Ruhn is the CEO of Normative, and the measurement of emissions is absolutely key. So do you want to come on up, Christian? Does the mic work?
Yes, it does. Brilliant.
Fantastic. So yeah, as I was mentioning, and as they were getting at, circular economy, the emissions cut across the scopes. So scope 1 and 2, which is mandatory in many places now. Scope 3 less so, but there is a huge part of the emissions piece that is addressed through circular economy in scope 3. You work with companies in order to help them measure where their footprint is. Can you tell us a bit about how many of the companies you work with, how many of them are starting to take a circular economy approach alongside the energy transition efforts that they're making?
To quickly answer that question, not enough. And not enough, I think, is always the answer to the question. And what we see over and over again is that most businesses around the planet have over 90% of their emissions in scope 3. And we did an analysis, and I've told this story a couple of times now, but we did an analysis of 1,000 companies and their net zero targets of those 1,000 companies, some of the largest companies on the planet, in fact. And they equate to 80% of global emissions, but almost all of those emissions are in the value chain. So if companies actually follow through with their value chain-based net zero commitments, it has a huge impact. So when we analyze the scope 3 of our clients, they obviously ask the first question: what can we do in order to reduce our scope 3 emission? And it all depends on what type of value chain it is. But I think there's two things, and those are exactly the two things that you mentioned in the introduction video. It is to switch to renewable types of energy, and it is to implement circular economy solutions. But obviously the first one is often the quick win, but that might only get you so far, you know. In order to go the full way of net zero, you need to think about circular economy, and that often takes a bit of time. So you need to think about it right now, because building value chains takes several decades. And so to implement circular economy solutions in your value chain will probably take many, many years as well. And you need to think about it now, and we provide our clients with the actionable insights to start to have those conversations.
Great. Can you tell us a bit more about what those actionable insights are from how you work with them? And is it around, how much of that is also working, is it to do with the data that you can provide? Is it to do with the knowledge sharing that you can provide about the opportunity? Like, what is it that you can provide?
So often it's at a quite basic level. So for instance, you know, switch from virgin materials to non-virgin materials. I think that is an obvious one. But what we see over and over again is that, you know, there is often those, you know, quick wins. So that it's often at that level. But in order to kind of contribute to society in general, you need to think about the more holistic perspective as well. How do you implement a circular business model in your own organization, not just, you know, making sure that you procure materials that are circular and non-virgin materials.
The thing with the circular economy is part of it is relatively, like the virgin material switch is, I think, one of the areas that's easier to capture in the emissions tracking, where it's keeping a product in use, so therefore you're avoiding another item being created. That's a challenging area. Do you work with companies on that? How they tackle, what recommendations do you have for where you're trying to account for avoided emissions?
We're beginning to work on that. And I think it's an incredibly important area. I mean, from a life cycle perspective, the best way to reduce emissions is just to increase how long you can have the product in circulation, so to speak. And something that we try to work with as possible, as much as possible whenever relevant, is the whole idea around the kind of waste hierarchy, if you will, from the European Union of, okay, the best thing we can do is to actually reuse the product, extend the length of the product, and there is often kind of a tenth in terms of emission savings for each step you take of the ladder. You know, going from reuse to material recycling, energy recycling, etc., and try to educate them on some of these basic concepts and how it relates to their core business model. But in a lot of those conversations, it's early days.
How long do you work with a company for when you're helping them to track their emissions? How long is that partnership?
I mean, hopefully for several decades. I mean, the net zero commitments are for several decades. But with that in mind, we have existed. We're a relatively young company. We're the first carbon emission accounting engine, so we have existed for around 10 years, and we have had some corporate clients for almost that entire journey. Most brunt of our clients are entirely new. We have only worked with them for 1 year, 2 year, and this is typically what you see when you have an exponential scaling journey, which is what we have had. Doubling or tripling the amount of clients that we bring on board every single year. But that also means that a lot of those clients are new to core sustainability concepts, and we're there to help. But I mean, even if you have done this for 10 years, 20 years, scope 3 is, I think, new in a sense for everyone, and the things that you can do in order to reduce your scope 3 emissions. And I think the core there is that you really need the data from the value chain, because in the end, your scope 3 emissions is the sum of the scope 1 emissions of your downstream and upstream suppliers and the use phase of the product as well.
I think what you said there about data availability is absolutely key. And I've spoken to other companies who, in the absence of necessarily having all of that, have to use a proxy and try to establish a baseline of what they know right now in order to be able to compare against that. If there is a product that's now avoiding another product being created, that they have some way of comparing it. Is that also what you do in terms of comparing it to a baseline?
So you mean like if we do avoided emissions calculations? No, we don't do that at the moment, and it's something that is incredibly tricky to do, right? Because you need some sort of baseline counterfactual, and it's okay. Is that baseline truthful? And what we see over and over again is that sometimes companies might be overly generous with the baseline in order to show a high degree of avoided emissions. This is not to say that avoided emissions is not important. It is super, super important, but we need the right standards to fully engage with it. So right now we deal with scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions and no scope 4 emissions, because we want to figure out the most accurate way to do so.
Yeah, great. I mean, I think that's also reflective of where we are in the journey of trying to bring the material side of this into the climate action space. We heard from both companies earlier about the material side is easier to start with, so that's where you're building up data, but absolutely the next bit of data needs to be gathered. Last question before you leave us. You might have already covered it in early answers, but what do you think is missing to help us get to net zero? What would be your key thing that you would like to see come into perspective?
I think we need to start with accurate accounting to keep companies accountable, but then also use that data to drive the right actions, both in your own operation and in your value chain, because you shouldn't just collect data for the sake of collecting data. Data is only useful to the extent that it actually drives the right actions, and those might be actions related to energy, it might be actions related to circular economy, and so on.
Great, thank you so much for joining us. All right, this is I said at the beginning, we had a lot of different companies from a lot of different sectors wanting to be part of this, and it's great because the circular economy really does cut across the sectors. So we have 3 more companies to hear a little bit about how they are working with the circular economy. Can I welcome Ala Saluste from Ragn-Sells? Can I welcome Anna Elsing from Alfa Laval and Martin Edlund from Minesto? Okay, you're our first panel of 3, so you'll all have to be practicing conciseness. Just to kick us off, because not everyone will necessarily know what you do. Ella, can I start with you? Can you give us a brief insight into what Ragn-Sells does?
Yeah, Ragn-Sells is a 141 years old family-owned business, and what we're doing is we started 130 years ago, mainly on collection of waste. But today we are focusing a lot on production of raw materials from waste. So we're kind of in the end of the linear economy and the start of the circular economy. So we want to be there. And we have a lot of awesome projects that we're presenting here also on COP to produce different kinds of raw materials from precipitated calcium carbonate to nitrogen, phosphorus, and so on.
I'm going to come on to that example. And yesterday when we were talking, I asked you, like, where in the value chain do you sit? And that's exactly what you were saying. Like, now we're at the end, but in the future, in a circular economy, well, there is no beginning and end. You're just part of a cycle. Anna, can you tell us a little bit about what Alfa Laval does?
Yes. Alfa Laval, we are technology leaders in heat transfer, separation, and fluid handling. And those are the processes behind the scene many times in such as food, the clean water we drink every day, and in energy. And we are committed to carbon neutral by 2030 and this net zero, of course, also. And that's how I see that we also very much connect, as everybody else has said, Aya and Owen before, to the circular economy. It's a must for us to make it.
Great. And Martin, finish us off. What does Minesto do?
Yes, we are an ocean renewable company with a unique high-performing technology to convert tidal and ocean currents into electricity. And we're a scale-up company, so we're 70 people. So I think we bring somewhat different challenges and perspectives than the really big actors that we've heard about earlier. So glad to be here.
Great. And I think it's also important to remember that actually the circular economy applies just as much to the energy sector itself, because it also requires materials, as it does to every other sector. Anna, partnerships came up earlier. Yeah. I know that you've been working on sourcing fossil-free steel and recycled content. So it's a really interesting approach to have it at both ends. If more recycled content was coming into your business, then you would possibly need less fossil-free steel coming in. So what's the balance, and how are you trying to handle that?
Yes, a lot of our products are made of steel. So we need to focus on how do we get that down, that carbon footprint. And if we look, it's complex, because the answer to your question depends on where we source the steel. If we go to the US, well, then it would be 60%. If we go to China, it would be 0, and that's because there are 2 different processes of making the steel. And one can handle the scrap or the recycled materials, and one cannot. And if we want to go for just recycled and not use the virgin, then we would have to increase the capacity on a global level for the one process that can really handle scrap. And that's a bit far from our impact. But we can, of course, as you said, we can then work together with, for example, SSAB to get that fossil-free steel on the market. But we could also look into what can we do with what we already have, like reuse. How can we reuse and design our products in the best way to be reused over and over? Like our heat exchangers, that they have very much been designed for circularity. You can refit, redesign them over and over again. And then at the end of life, which could be about 30 or more years, then we can recycle them almost 100%. So very much closing the loops. And again, also having a longer lifespans by really much inventing digital innovation and AI solutions for services. That's also a very important part.
And in both of those, the partnerships on the fossil-free steel side and on the recycled content side, they're different, right? And they vary.
Yes,
okay.
They do.
Yeah, it's another example of how, as Aya said, no one company can do it alone. So, innovation, absolutely key. I think Ragn-Sell's innovation is kind of at your core. Can you give us an example? I think you're already holding it in your hand. Can you tell us about how this reflects some of the circular economy principles in it?
Yeah, I think what I'm holding in my hand is a quite unique thing for circular economy and also for decarbonisation. Half of this powder is CO2, so it's calcium carbonate, so the carbonate part is CO2. It's made from waste, from oil shale ash, and it can be used, for example, for plastic windows or any other material that needs a filler or needs to be in very nice white color. But what is more important about this is that this product is climate positive because it actually bounds more CO2 than it emits when you produce it. But what is important about today's subject and the cooperation is that I think Alfa Laval is a perfect example where we need each other. We need equipment from Alfa Laval to make this process happen. And Alfa Laval needs our recycled materials to have the necessary kind of equipment. The steel or in this project we have a potential also to produce magnesium, iron, aluminium and so on. So through circular economy and doing it with either with a zero or even with a negative CO2 footprint.
When we were talking yesterday and you were starting to explain that to me, my next question was, okay, so you've produced a product from something that used to be a waste and had no value. Then in your application of it, how do you then try and figure out once it's applied to something that too is then able to stay in ongoing use?
Yeah, absolutely. That's kind of one of the things you have to think about in circular economy is that when we want to keep the CO2 in a loop or still not in the atmosphere, so somewhere in a product, we have to select the customers that actually think about recycling, so they don't or they are responsible for their product for many cycles, not only one. So they make sure that, for example, we have a good example, Tarkett, who's a world top 5 flooring producer, and they have ambition to recycle their products for maybe even for hundreds of years, if possible. So those kind of things, we try to select our partners through that and build kind of first good examples and so the others can follow.
So in a way, it's building on your forward customer chain as well as working with things that are coming to you through your natural business model.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, great. So the energy sector, you've got your product. I think most of the time you are probably focused more here at COP on talking on the energy side, but again, it has a material element. So how do you factor that into the design of Minesto?
Well, as you can imagine, a small company with 70 employees driving an innovation forward, the whole demand and the obligations that the pressure from the circular economy thinking sustainability is an add-on that makes it perhaps even more challenging to be in the renewable energy sector today, because when you talk to investors, green funds, they ask of you to actually show your carbon footprints, your life cycle analysis. Also when you go for public funding and soft loans to build your first reference facilities. So it's an add-on challenge that we are forced to deal with. Fortunately for us, we have, compared to all other technologies in this sector of ocean energy, we have very lightweight systems. So they weigh 10 to 20 times less than competing systems. So that gives us sort of just fortunate, it gives us a huge advantage when we do those life cycle analysis calculations. But it is a challenge for us. And we can see, for instance, that even if we would use carbon fiber, which is difficult to recycle and it will give you sort of a burden from a carbon footprint perspective, we can also see that we will gain a lot by reducing cost of transportation and diesel and crude oil dimension. So the whole systemic analysis of this is something that I would say we are looking actually to find partnerships to get more support to do this, because as a small company we cannot have all this in-house. So I know that there are a few candidates for this in this panel, for example. But I also would like to point out that I don't think that there is a complete separation between the renewable transition and the circular economy. We need, in many cases, we need to actually increase our energy consumption in order to be circular. And of course, if we do that with the wrong sources of energy, we are just sort of increasing the burden. And in the Faroe Islands, where we are and have our reference facilities, I think the fish farming industry is a great example where we now in the Faroes, we see that there is a huge recycling of fresh water. So it's up to 99% of the water is being reused in the, sort of the tank phase. The first 2/3 of the salmon farming lead time is onshore, and it's very energy intense. So when we're working with our customers and partners, SEV, they are here in the room as well, that's why I'm pointing, we see that there is a very clear consumer and customer demand. In order to get a premium for your salmon, to sell it as a sustainable product to the sashimi restaurants in New York, they're not even flying the salmon there anymore. They are shipping them there in order to keep the carbon footprint low. But no point if we can't deliver a complete 100% energy offer to them. So it goes hand in hand, those things. And in that sense, it's a driver for us. So that is to our advantage. But when we're asked to do the full analysis, we will need more help, I think, actually.
Okay, great. And I like how you're there connecting it to other industries and looking beyond just your own product, but also then how you would then feed into another company's efforts to... it also leads nicely to incentives. Each one of you, obviously, there are incentives that already exist through policy, but there will be things that you're uncovering through your own innovations where you need more policy help. So, Anna, to start with you, what policy asks would you have specifically around accelerating the circular economy transition?
Yeah, there would be many, but if I connect to what you said, Martin, that there is both the need of energy and material, and focus on that, and start with a huge potential about also implement, this COP is about implementing and acting now, then we have huge potential in energy efficiency that is already here and now. It's affordable just by doing the service that on our heat exchanger in the right way would save 50 gigawatts per year. That would mean also 2.5% on a global scale reducing carbon emissions. So if we have more regulations as in housing, for example, but also in the industry sector for energy efficiency actions, that would be very good. And we, on the material side, I can connect back to the fossil-free steel. To be able to know that we actually source fossil-free steel, we need a standard. At this moment, we don't know what is actually fossil-free steel. So that would be a very good example of policy we need.
I think that question of standard and trying to make sure that what you're aiming for, but also what is claimed, is actually in line with what you're after.
Exactly.
Yeah. Ala, where do you see the need for policy in what you're doing?
Well, yeah.
I'm asking you, like, where do you need policy? It is not the question of, like, where do you not need it, but where do you need it to help you grow?
I think if you are using waste as a raw material as we do, there's a lot of challenges there. I think the legislation is not ready for circular economy at all. Basically, there's a situation that any kind of raw material that is in the ground, it could be even more hazardous than the waste. But if it's not classified as waste, then building a plant and using that resource is quite a low effort. But if you take the waste, which could be in a lot of cases more stable, more inert, but it's waste, you get the full force of the legislation. And that's in Estonia, in Sweden, in all of the EU. So that hinders a lot, because the situation is like we dump a lot of money into R&D and development, and I think the raw materials are the first place where you can make a quick change. But when we reach a point where actually these projects would start making money back, then the legislation makes everything so complicated. If you want to build a plant, you get the full force. Also, one other example is the CO2. We are kind of forced in this project. We need about 250,000 tons of CO2 per year, and today's political will and in the Commission and also the legislative side forces us not to use the nearby source of the CO2 from energy production, rather to ship it in from Sweden, from Germany, which is not logical in any way. CO2 is CO2, it doesn't matter. So any gram that is not emitted is good. But the problem is not technical there, it's legislative. But that's why we're here, kind of to spread the word, to kind of talk about these things, so to make it better.
Yeah, great. I mean, it is an innovation, so that dialogue with the policymakers does absolutely need to be there. And I think you're flagging there the importance of standards has already come up, but also the question of trade and companies working across borders, and how one thing is considered as something on one side and not the other is really important to build alignment there. Christian, what would you say? What are the sort of policy needs that you would need from both a startup perspective, but also this integration of the two sides of energy and materials?
Yeah, I mean, we are far beyond the startup phase, if you may call it so. So I'd say it's very much about incentivizing the world's first of a kind, larger commercial scale production facilities, and to do that in a closed loop with a sustainable, supply loop. I think that will be the showcases that will drive transition faster. And I think the other end of it is actually also to make sure that consumers are informed. They need the tools and the information to be able to make decisions. And I think that the sashimi there in New York is, for me, a very good example that if you're selling that as sustainable sashimi, then you should also be able to provide the evidence that that's the case. So I think those two areas, to really get the information to the consumers and incentivize investments in large-scale reference installations of what we do.
Yeah, great. And I'm just going to connect our conversation back briefly with the conversation we had about measurement. How important is actually building a much better idea of the emissions reduction potential of your circular economy activity in your companies? Anna?
Yeah, it is very important. I think data is knowledge, or knowledge is data, and power to act. And it's a systemic it's a dynamic, complex system that we're dealing with, and the gut feeling is usually not the right one. So I think it's very important with data, but I encourage everyone also to try to figure out what is good enough data, because sometimes I hear in conversation you're driving just for the data, but there's also very evident things you can act on here and now. So I mean, it's both, but we need data.
And is it something that in your case you think you're starting to build a good picture of in terms of the link to CO2 or wider emissions?
Yes, we do. We have, in the case of carbon neutral, we have our baseline. We collect the data. We're looking into also how can we create this digital passport, for example, that is within the EU Green Deal. That would be a very good regulation or legislation coming. So yes, we are.
Yeah. The digital passport idea is, so that you can better have an idea of material flows, in fact, because actually a lot of companies don't, and cities and governments, it's not something that typically people are focused on very much.
No. And I think it also, for us, it's a big challenge with very many thousands of suppliers. We have SMEs, small ones, but also big ones. Some are good at the data, and we can track the flows of materials. But then how we get to the smaller ones and get them on track, and how can we help them also and train and give the right tools to do that.
Okay, great. I'm going to switch the order. Where does it come in for you, like building that picture of your emissions, where the emissions are coming from, and knowing that and being able to work with that?
I mean, we obviously need that for our own purposes to analyze. So we swap out, instead of having concrete gravity-based foundations to anchor the systems, we attach them with drilling in the seabed instead, and we get rid of an enormous part of the carbon footprint with 1,000 tons of concrete. So, I mean, that analysis needs to be done, and we need to do more than we're doing today to be relevant in that sense. But I think for us, the real driver is when there is a demand chain from the leading companies in Western Europe that put demands on their supply chains globally. I was now previous to G20, I was in Indonesia for a week talking to the energy department, basically all the independent power producers at scale. And it's obvious that if they fuel their value chains with lignite, brown coal-based electricity, it's going to be really difficult to deliver your batteries to Volvo's EVs, for instance, because you burden yourself so much from the start, so you're not going to be relevant. So this whole transition for them to be more value-adding, to grow their economy, a driver is the transition into sustainable supply chains, where the energy demand then, of course, is closest to our hearts in that.
Yep. Alaa, how does it look for you? I mean, you're actually dealing with a lot of different material flows, I believe. So.
Exactly, yeah. But for us, maybe the most important part is actually, because we see that for the next 10 years at least, there's a huge advantage in selling materials like this, so that they have a reduced footprint or 100% reused material, and etc. And we need transparency there, so that our customers are sure that if I tell them, okay, this is done like that it really is. Because if it's the kind of not a fair fight, someone can maybe do it, as you discussed, calculate it a little bit differently and end up with a much better result, although maybe our product is still better. So that's one kind of clarity what we need. Of course, if we need also raw materials to kind of sustain our processes and so on. If we can switch all those to the zero materials, that will even more kind of enlarge the potential of our climate savings.
Great. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us. I think we've had... let's give them a round of applause at this point. Even for me, it's been a whole wealth of different sectors giving some of the examples. I mean, it is another part of the transition that we need to make in order to get to net zero. So I hope from this you take away that it is not just the energy transition, it is also the need to look at the materials, how we produce and consume. And within that, there is a whole wealth of innovation and economic opportunity that exists. And I think for customers, often what they really want is that they want the need fulfilled, and then the businesses can find the solutions and innovations as to how to do that. So the change that's embedded within the circular economy is actually a real opportunity for us to strive towards. And there are definitely governments and cities who are putting together circular economy plans. There too, we need to make sure those are also connected to the climate piece. Sometimes they exist in parallel, as also in businesses, sometimes they exist in parallel. So growing that connection between the circular economy and the climate impact is really important. Of course, circular economy is not only about climate, it is also a broader transition on production and consumption, and we'll have benefits for biodiversity, we'll have a wide range of benefits, also pure tackling of waste and pollution. But obviously here in this conversation I wanted to, hopefully we brought out some of the climate connections, and hopefully there's more that we can do on that in the future. Thank you so much for joining us and online.